Okay, hi, welcome back to Foundations of Bioenergetics or Foundations of Body-Based Therapy with me, Devraj. I think we're up to about episode 10 maybe now. And this week we're going to look at Reichian segmental armouring. Great little three-word kind of thing, Reichian segmental armouring. Sounds very solid and like almost like a thing you might find in engineering or something like that. And in a sense, that's a little bit of an artifact of the era that Wilhelm Reich was writing in, which was back, in this case, in the 1930s, when psychiatry was really a very separate field from the kind of popular psychology that we have these days, and that isn't, as I see it, a particularly good thing. So psychiatry was this kind of technical thing that just a few kind of men, usually white men from, Austria, basically were really into, or certainly Northern Europe. And they talked about, the human condition and the human mind psychology rather as though, it was a little bit like components of a car or an engineering kind of thing. And I mention this because there is an important point here when you come to work with the body in therapy, in that it is not really very much like engineering. You can't really just, break things down to component modules, find the module of a problem, fix that, and everything just works like it would do in your car. Problems tend to be distributed across the whole system. It's all a bit more systemic, systems theory. Systems reach a critical kind of negative threshold and may collapse a bit. And all sorts of problems might come up. And, if our mind has been very much formatted with this idea of engineering, we try to apply it to the body. I'm working in my field and being quite prominent on social media. I get a lot of people, particularly young men, asking, how to fix this part of my psychology, how to fix this part. And there's nothing wrong with that, and it's good to have a focus. And it's good to be able to accurately articulate what you want to change. Nevertheless, that will not be simply fixing this module or something like that. Whilst it's good to be accurate, you also need to be a little bit loose and understand that you're dealing with a big system here. Okay, so that said, let's get back to Reichian segmental armouring. And, I see it a little bit as a different field from bioenergetics, a slightly different way of seeing things, a slightly different kind of map of the body that we can usefully use. Reich originally formulated this idea that there were 7 rings running laterally around the body, 7 rings of armour. So it's like there were eyes was the top one, mouth, throat or cervical, chest, diaphragmatic, abdominal, and pelvic and legs, basically. So those were the 7 rings that he came up with. And something that's important to understand here, because there's a lot of confusion amongst people who get into Reichian segmental armouring. It's like the armouring is not really a problem. We're traditionally brought up, if you're a bit into bio, a bit into body-based therapy, usually everyone's talking about armouring and how bad it is, basically. And this, in my opinion, is not useful. One thing why it's kind of happened is that probably the classic armoured personality was much more prevalent, say back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, when these therapies became popular, and specifically with the kind of client group of upper middle class, high functioning men and women. They tended to be more rigid armoured types. And so, it's easy to read a bit of this material and soon develop the perspective that like armouring is the big problem. And if we could just get rid of armouring, then, we would be fine. And this is really not, unless you're just super, super rigid, this is just not a useful mindset. This is just not really a particularly useful mindset to have. In fact, armouring is a lesser problem. Armouring is really muscles that have got unnaturally tense and cannot relax. On the other side of the scale, you have muscles where all awareness is kind of dropped out of them, like the person is almost on some physical level trying to play dead instead of being tensed and ready to kind of go on the attack or need to have a lot of control over their environment. You've also got a lot of people who've just they're playing dead somewhere. Their muscles have kind of collapsed and they're just hoping that nothing bad happens to them, and they just seek to avoid confrontation and please. So if you've got this idea in your head, armouring is bad, then try your best to open up a little bit, drop that a little bit. It's not that armouring is great, but it's not necessarily a problem. And this is significant here in Reichian segmental armouring, because these actual bands of armouring are kind of functional. They're doing something, you know. There's supposed to be a certain level of tension in this ocular band around my eyes here, likewise the oral one, you know, and the cervical one. There's supposed to be a certain level of tension, and most of the problems that arise in this system come from unhealthy levels of binding between the bands, between adjacent bands. So like if my oral band is super attached to my cervical band, then that is not good, and that's something that needs to be worked on. In addition, you do have the idea that there's too much tension in one of these bands, but it's important to understand that it's not as simplistic as that. You've also got this issue of tension, unhealthy tension between bands, and the two bands are bonded together, and that gives this overall kind of very rigid or armoured looking person, you know, someone who's just rigid. Their bands are all in tension. And we haven't really looked yet, you know, what's the bad thing about that? Does it really matter if we're super armoured? Well, in Reich's theory, you know, and I think it's pretty valid, he compared the human being essentially to an earthworm. Doesn't sound that great, but let me explain. The earthworm, you know, if you imagine an earthworm, when it travels through, it's got all these bands around its body, yeah, rings and rings around its body, and it kind of pushes its nose or whatever a little bit further through the earth, and then it pulls each band up behind it. So you can understand that, like, if the earthworm, basically, if there was unhealthy binding between some of these bands, it wouldn't be able to move. It wouldn't be able to pull that ring up, and so it would be stuck in the earth, you know, and obviously that wouldn't be so great for the earthworm. And in like manner, what Reich's talking about in the body is more of a movement of energy. You know, Reich was into energy. He later on formulated the concept of orgone and all this. Without going too much into that whole scene, you know, the idea was that energy naturally flows up the body. Or it naturally flows up, some would say it flows down, whatever, or up and down, but it can naturally flow. And if these bands are bonded up in an unhealthy way together, that blocks the flow. So like the earthworm, the person cannot be in any form of natural energetic movement with life. And this really is quite an interesting concept, because when you look at the world, particularly, you know, the world of Western society, it's a lot about trying to make things a certain way. You know, we lack fluidity. We just think if we can just get the world to be like this, you know, and get everyone to agree with to do it like this, then we'll all be okay. You know, and this is like, there is a huge overlooking in that belief of what life is about. It's not about some static vision of how the world should be, kind of guiding you onwards to the great, whatever you think it should be, libertarian, communist, whatever. You know, it's really not about that. This whole notion that we need to move individually or collectively towards some ideal kind of fixed way of being is completely nonsensical. It's completely nonsensical. It's absolutely not like that. Basically, what you need to do is to get energy to flow in your body naturally. And then the models that you make of how the world is will change. Anyway, they'll change all the time. So getting the energy flowing in the body was super important to Reich, and it should be, I think, super important to anyone who wants to have a good life, rather than trying to, you know, just get this very fixed, rigid concept of how things should be in your mind, and then you'll finally be okay or something. Now, I said earlier on that there were like 7 rings of armour in the body, and that we do exercises to work on these. Nowadays, you probably, I think, you know, there's not like tons of people that study this stuff, but I think it's pretty common to say that also the forehead is holding a lot. You know, in Jack Willis's book, Reich Home Book, you know, he's got exercises for this forehead, and I think those are very important, particularly because, you know, rather than being so rigid, we are still rigid, but rather than being so rigid, we're also very abstracted, you know, living in the head, and this creates a lot of head tension. And some people would also kind of not lump the pelvis and the legs together, but make them a bit separate. So we can happily say 9 if we want to. It doesn't matter that much. You know, some people agonize endlessly about exactly how many chakras there are, or exactly, you know, like how many bands of tension are there, you know. It doesn't matter that much. The main thing is that we engage with the concept and really start to do the physical exercises necessary. because they will take us out of that heavy rigidity of trying to understand objectively exactly how things should be or are. Now, this being more of a theoretical thing, I'm not actually going to talk about the kinds of exercises that we do, but there's an excellent workout which actually works, I believe, all 9 bands on my YouTube channel. You can look up the Reichian Segmental Armouring workout. I think it's about a year ago, which is sometime in 2024. Should have checked that before I made this video. Didn't, but it's sometime around there. And you know, that's an excellent introduction as well, and it also shows you exercises that you can do in one workout to work all of these bands. You know, it's really great. It's a really awesome workout. But essentially what you're doing is, you know, you're usually doing it in the Reichian working position, which is lying down with your knees up and the soles of your feet gently planted, feet about hip width apart. And then your eyes are usually closed except for a couple of the specific exercises. And generally what you're doing is one of 2 things. I mean, there's some variation as well, but generally what you're doing is kind of belly breathing or breathing fairly deeply with your belly and your chest. And then you're either holding tension in one part of your body, like your forehead, like I furrow my brow, I'm lying down, I'm furrowing my brow, and I'm doing my belly breathing, trying to keep that furrowing going. Especially difficult on the exhale, when the furrowing will tend to relax unless you really hold it. So you hold the tension the whole way through in and out exhales for a certain period of time, maybe 90 seconds is quite a good length of time to work with. Alternatively, you may do one thing on the inhale to a band and one thing on the exhale. For example, on the inhale, when you're working with the ocular ring, you could be eyes wide open, as wide as you can as you inhale, and then eyes tight shut, as tight as you can as you exhale. So these are 2 ways of working. You know, mostly you've got fairly deep breathing going, ideally with the abdominals involved as well. And then you're working these different rings in certain ways. Now, there are variations as we get further down the body. In particular, you know, there's different exercises that you can do. You can look these up also in my book, Reichian breathing, or Reichian breath work actually, and also Jack Willis's home book. You know, it's got a lot of stuff like that in there. But this is basically Reichian segmental armouring, and if you regularly work on these rings, you will find that your energy starts to flow better. And then this very kind of rigid mindset can dissolve, and you feel like you can orient yourself better in the world. You know, it's okay. You know, you don't have to have this high level of control from your mind. Okay, so that's an introductory talk to Reichian segmental armouring. I've also got a piece about it on Substack and stuff like the workout, and also a theoretical thing on my YouTube channel. Feel free to look those up if you're intrigued. Otherwise, don't forget to check out my website, bioenergetics.org.uk, for more bioenergetics and body-based therapy stuff. And I'll see you again next time for more foundations of bioenergetics. Thank you.